I appreciate your time. I appreciate you prioritizing your children in this way. So I know that we are short on time in as much as I want to deliver content for you that's going to be very high level, so that we have time for lots of questions later on. So I really encourage you, as you come up with your questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A or in the chat box. We'll get to them at the end, but I can promise you that you'll forget about it. You'll be like, oh, I had a really good question, and it won't come up. So go ahead and do that. And in the meantime, let's get started. So to tell you just a little bit about me, my name is Gwendolyn Jones, and I'm here from the Amazing Educating Matters. I started my career with a bachelor's degree in psychology and then trained at PG Cert as a special education teacher, working with children who were labeled emotionally disturbed and behavior disordered. So those are nice labels to start life out with, but we move forward from there, and that's okay. But what I realized after 9 years of teaching in the United States and in the United Kingdom is I didn't so much care about reading and math. It was kind of boring to me, but I loved working with relationship and behavior and understanding neurodivergence. So I retrained as a relationship therapist, psychotherapist. I'm a PCC trained coach. And through all of that, I discovered Educating Matters in this amazing space of like workplace well-being and parenting networks. And that is kind of the space that I love to serve, is with working families, because it's just a language that I speak and I understand. So when we talk about what is my expertise in neurodivergence, well, I have 45 years experience as a neurodivergent individual. And I was not diagnosed until I was 22 with ADHD, which was a life-changing moment in my life, and we can talk about that another time if you want. But I also married somebody who this year has been diagnosed as autistic, and I am the mother of 4 neurodivergent children. So in our house, sometimes we forget that the neurotypical world exists and that everybody doesn't have some sort of label attached to them. So it's a fun place to be, but we also learn how to speak each other's languages, which we'll talk about in a little bit. I'm also a lifelong activist and ally. Allyship is a huge passion of mine, which is another thing we can talk about later on, about how to show up as an ally to different communities. Educating Matters is always here to offer you private consultations, to offer you more different specific seminars. So if there's something that you're wanting for your network, just reach out to Rachel, let us know, and we'll get it going for you. So I want to start with this slide, which is almost, I have a picture of my son that looks almost exactly like this, but it was poor quality, so I did this one instead. Let's talk about the neurodivergent brain in your kids for a second, because the thing is, their brain is very curious and it is always learning. And because it is always learning in a neurotypical space, it is always exhausted. Imagine that if you walk into a room, or if you've ever been into a fun house and everything is kind of turned about 20 degrees and you're constantly trying to find your balance and you're trying to kind of figure out, how do I walk, how do I talk, how do I move in this space? It can be incredibly exhausting. And so because of that level of exhaustion and that level of vigilance that our children have to have, they can often get labels that come from a place of misunderstanding. So what I hope we have the ability to do today is to understand, what do we mean by neurodivergence? I know you probably know a lot more about your own child than anybody else in this world will, but let's talk about, where do these labels come from? How can we help support them? And how do we work with the people whose job it is to support our children? So I want to talk about executive functioning, because it's a word that gets, or a phrase that gets thrown around a lot, but what do we actually mean by that? And what does it matter with neurodiversity? So when we talk about how somebody shows up in the world as neurodiverse, usually what we're talking about is the ability to either show up or not show up in your executive functioning skills. So if we were to take me and my son as an example, my son's autistic and he's much more mature than I am. He very much keeps me in check. So we're kind of two sides of the same coin. So impulse control, thinking before I act, that is a skill I had to learn. And I wish I'd learned it a little earlier in life than I had, but here we are. Whereas my son had a natural aversion to risk. So he, from the time he was very young, was very controlled and well thought out in every single decision that he made, to his own detriment, that he would have a hard time getting into the swimming pool until he had gone through a process of risk assessment before he stepped in. Then there's things like emotional control. So keeping my feelings in check, pretty good at now, not so good at as a kid. I was a very reactive child. My autistic son, on the other hand, as far as emotional control was concerned, he was very, very controlled, but he was kind of like a duck. So he looked like he was smooth sailing across that water, but those little feet were going and going and going and going. And then he would have meltdowns when he got home because he was containing it so much for so long. Flexible thinking is an area where I excel. So even just the other week, I was doing a presentation for a friend's school of mine on neurodivergence. And about an hour and a half before, they said, thanks so much. By the way, make sure that you have the right slide deck. And I realized 2 weeks before that they'd given me a slide deck to use and I wasn't supposed to use my own. And I was like, all right. And I just changed it. It didn't stress me out to have to change, didn't stress me to have to turn. My son, on the other hand, they changed the deadline for one of his assignments a month ahead of time, and it took him 2 weeks to wrap his head around it because it caused him so much anxiety because he had it planned out to the day what he was going to do over the course of a month. Working memory is a really important one. So I want you to think about when you learned your times tables when you were a kid and you're at home and you're like, I've got my 8 times tables. I can rattle them off. You're with your mom. You're bam, 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 getting your times tables out. And then somebody asks you to stand up and say them in front of the class. And anxiety creeps in. And all of a sudden you can't access that memory because immediate stress, immediate anxiety takes over your working memory space, and it takes you a little bit more time. This is why so many of our neurodivergent children need extra time on their exams. It has nothing to do with their ability to take or process that test. It's because the test anxiety that they feel takes up so much space that accessing that working memory is difficult. Self-monitoring is another one. Any adult who is neurodivergent has probably learned ways to monitor themselves like you wouldn't believe, because it's our way of trying to figure out how to fit in, how, kind of looking around the room going, why is it so easy for everyone else to do this, but it's so hard for me? I'm just going to pretend to be like Jocelyn because she seems to have her stuff together, or I'm going to try and be like Carol because she has her stuff together, and I'm going to monitor myself compared to people around me. Whereas other neurodivergent people might be like, I'm doing this because it is right, and I feel I have a strong sense of justice and a strong sense of process, and monitoring other people's emotions and other people's reactions or the impact on other people can be difficult. Planning and prioritizing, this is one that makes me laugh because I feel like it should be in 2 different pieces of the pie, because I can make plans on plans on plans. I have backup plans for my backup plans. Now ask me to prioritize a task list, that takes extra effort. Whereas my son makes the plan and he can task prioritize very, very well, but because he lacks that flexible thinking, struggles to pivot. Task initiation is one that I'm actually in the middle of writing a blog post on because it gets confused with motivation. Many neurodivergent people think, oh, I'm not motivated. But the truth is, it's a momentum issue. People say, how do you eat an elephant? Well, you eat it one bite at a time. But the neurodivergent mind is going, should I start with the ear or the trunk? Or should I go with the foot? Or maybe I should start on the top. Or maybe and you get overwhelmed by knowing where to start. But once that task is initiated, momentum builds. So momentum and motivation often get confused when working in neurodivergence. Organization is another one. If you could see my desk right now, you would laugh, but it looks really clean behind me, right? I believe in organized chaos. I do have a wardrobe of clothes that I'm going to put away eventually. And my older son comes in and he shakes his head at me because his room, since he was 2 years old, has been the cleanest room in my house completely. He organized his Legos by color and by size. And his clothes are always very pristine. He is the organization king. So you can see how within neurodivergence, there are areas that you are going to super excel at here, right? And there are areas that where you are going to need some support. But as a parent, what we have to think about is, first of all, our reaction. So if my child is struggling with emotional control, my reaction matters more than any intervention that I put in. If I am shaming and guilting from the get, what are they going to feel? What are they going to learn? They're going to learn the first thing I teach them. So rather than teaching them to be ashamed of themselves, I want to teach them that I can be their emotional container and help them learn to regulate, help them learn to have a bottom-up process to feel what's happening in their body before what's happening in their brains. Know that less is more in any of these. Sometimes as parents, we love the sound of our own voice. I know I do. But our children, after about sentence 3 or 4, they're going like this, and they're starting to nod, and they're agreeing with you, but really in their heads, they're going, if I do this long enough, she'll stop talking and I can go play Minecraft. So know that you're wanting to keep any sort of intervention or any words about learning very, very condensed. Don't be afraid of the W word when they ask why. So why is that so important? Why do I have to care about how this impacts somebody else? Why is it that I need to change? Take some time and lean into that, because if you can actually lean into that why, which for many of our children is actually, they need the answer to that why as much as we need air. If we can take the time to answer the why, then we don't have to waste time on interventions for behaviors that come from a frustration of not knowing why. Know that representation matters. So when you see people in the media, when you see people in their movies, in the world who are excelling at or struggling with any of these skills, we say, oh, look, mom does that too. Or, oh, look, this person does that too. It helps them understand that they're not alone. I can tell you, as growing up as a neurodivergent child who was undiagnosed, but also considered to be gifted and talented, I was always told about what's wrong with you? Why aren't you meeting your potential? And if I had had some representation of somebody else who found it difficult to put papers in a folder or to turn in their homework that they'd spent all their time on, it would have made a world of difference for me. And understanding within our phrasing and with our children, both neurotypical and neurodivergent, that there is a difference between different and weird. Children use the word weird a lot, and what they actually mean is different, but weird has a qualifying factor to it. So we don't want to make them feel like you are lesser for needing support in some area. We want them to know that you are different. They know. I can promise you, I knew I was different. All of my kids knew that they were different. What would have been helpful to me is to know that that's okay and that's completely normal to be different. And let them know that you're always open for discussion in areas that they might need support. So I thought I would take a look at kind of 4 of the main diagnoses that children are getting nowadays. So with dyslexia, they're 10% of the population. So for your kids who feel really othered by being dyslexic, let them know, man, 1 in 10 people are dyslexic. It's recognized by other people as a difficulty with reading, writing, and spelling, but actually it is a neurological condition. It is not an eyesight thing. It is not a reading thing. So because of that, there's also a struggle with working memory because, sorry, I thought someone else. There's, oh yeah?
It's slow.
Sorry, is that a question? Okay, I can't tell if that's a question for me or not, so I'm going to keep on going.
It is. Carry on, please.
Okay, sorry, somebody's mic's on. Cool. All right. So children are going to struggle with working memory because they're stressed out from having to spend so much extra focus on reading. If they're having to focus that much more on decoding these words, then they're really going to struggle with comprehension because all they're focusing on is the decoding, the sounding it out. They also sometimes struggle with understanding verbal directions that are combined with written directions. So it's really good for these children to have one or the other. Organization and sequencing can often be an early sign of dyslexia. So children, beginning, middle, and end. If children struggle to do that when telling a story, it's worth paying attention to. And also difficulty with time management. Time blindness is a huge area of support needed by dyslexia or by dyslexic people. So, but the strength of dyslexic people is they are incredibly creative, and I mean naturally creative, like in a way that is awe-inspiring. Many of our greatest artists have been are dyslexic. They have an amazing ability for spatial awareness to see things 3D. Many dyslexic people go into graphic design, but also they're great at scaffolding out plans within an organization or scaffolding out plans with even their play. If you pay attention to how the depth of their play, it's amazing. Creative design, artwork, because they've had to learn to express themselves differently, their artwork is usually just above and beyond, or can be above and beyond, I should say. And their verbal communication skills are often well above that of their peers because it's a coping mechanism. They need to be able to communicate that they know what they're talking about. And they are amazing big picture thinkers. So let your dyslexic children know that there are companies who are specifically advertising for dyslexic thinkers in the future. So it will be a strength for them, even if it feels like an obstacle for them as they go through school. So then we have dyspraxia, which is also 10% of the population, and half of dyslexic people just about are also dyspraxic. This is about gross and or fine motor skills. So poor hand-eye coordination, either with, think gross motor skills like throwing a ball, fine motor skills like cutting with scissors and writing. They can have spatial awareness challenges as well. Many dyspraxic children will also have a squint or a lazy eye in American terms. And so because of that, it makes it difficult for them to have that 3D kind of organization. They also struggle with organization, but for different reasons. So if I'm spending time trying to make my body move right, that is what's taking up my working memory. So it's very hard for me to plan 4 or 5 tasks in advance because I'm just trying to make my body move through this one. Short-term memory is not their best friend because, again, the amount of head space it takes up and front brain space it takes up to be able to remember to move from point A to point B, and how do I move my body and how do I do it without tripping over, means that multi-step directions will be difficult. There's also something called verbal dyspraxia, which is showing up more and more. This is where I struggle to get my words out, so it might seem that I have a very limited vocabulary because I might have a huge stutter or choose certain words or struggle with the communication side of things, but my writing and my what comes out as I communicate in a different way is very, very different. But dyspraxic people have incredible leadership skills because they've had to see point, so they can make a plan for the future very, very naturally. They have a huge amount of empathy because they're paying attention to how does their body interact with the world around them, which gives them the natural ability to understand how their emotions can react with the world around them. They are incredible, all these soft skills we need in corporates, active listening, because they really have to focus on that when they're getting multi-step directions as children. They're great at strategy. Man, these are the kids that have got a plan and they can really strategize with how to move forward. And their problem-solving skills, when you put them on standardized testing, have a tendency to be well above that of their peers because they need to, because they have problems and difficulties with tasks that have been given to them that were not appropriate for them or that they weren't supported with in the right way. And they've needed to learn that problem-solving skill as a matter of survival. Now we have my people, the ADHD people of the world. We are 2.5 to 3% of the population, although the idea is that is possibly doubling as more and more women are finally getting diagnosed. Time management is one of those skills with ADHD people that can be really imbalanced. So for me, I feel time. I can feel that I'm about 20 minutes into this presentation, and I know I am. Like I can wake up without an alarm clock. Other ADHD people are time blind, where they can sit there and work on something and all of a sudden realize it's been 12 hours, everybody's gone home, and they still need to feed the dog, right? ADHD is probably the poorest named condition in the world because it is not that people have a deficit of attention. It is that we have an overabundance of attention. I describe it as there are 8 people in the room who are having a conversation with me, and I'm pretty aware of all 8 conversations, and I actually sit quite comfortably being able to dip in and out of those conversations. My struggle is remembering who do I need to concentrate on at the moment. So it's a difficulty knowing where to put your concentration as opposed to your attention. Staying on topic, man, when you put 3 ADHD people in a conversation, it is hilarious to watch neurotypical people go, how do they know what they're talking about? Because it is all around the houses. It is web thinking, not linear thinking. But eventually we all come back to the topic and it makes sense to us. Rationality, that can be a very judgmental sounding word, but what it really means is we are natural big sky thinkers and we think of many different outcomes. And because of that, knowing what's possible is a second step as opposed to a first step when we start thinking about solutions. And procrastination is a huge one. Know that procrastination is an anxiety state. It is not a sign of laziness. It's that taking that initial step, that first that task initiation skill is so difficult that I'm going to put it off off until the pressure of having to get this done on this deadline is so extreme that I'm going to knock it out in an hour. Most of your ADHD kids will do all of their assignments in a day, as opposed to doing them over the course of a month. What are our skills? Hyper-focus. Man, if you get an ADHD person to hyper-focus, it's amazing what they can accomplish. They zoom in, they can get more accomplished in 6 hours than some people can do in a week. We're naturally creative because we can think of 7 different things at a time. And so spinning out creative solutions is really easy for us. Many people say that there's a natural charisma and enthusiasm, also a coping mechanism, because when you have a hyperactive body and a hyperactive mouth, like I did in class, I was the girl who always talked too much. You needed to be charismatic to make friends because the teachers were always telling you that you were wrong and off. And if you didn't have something else, then the kids would get on that with you. But we're amazing innovators because we do not see rationality as a limitation of our ideas. So a lot of innovation, if you sit down with a business idea with somebody with ADHD, they can help you spin out into places that you wouldn't believe that can be incredibly beneficial. So then we have our autism. So these are two of both my boys, I should say, are autistic, and my husband. So 1 in 59 children are currently diagnosed, but again, that might be changing. This is a lot about sensory sensitivity. So I want you to not just think about auditory noise, but also visual noise. They can get very overstimulated, even tactile noise. So my oldest son wears his socks inside out because the seam in the sock feels like daggers in his toes. There's also a difficulty with emotional interpretation. Now, this is not how they usually describe it, because autistic people get branded as people who don't have emotions or don't have empathy. This is not true. It's that they do not demonstrate their emotions in the same way as neurotypical people. And sometimes they struggle to understand the emotions that are happening from others. So it's not about not having emotions, it's about being able to interpret and being able to communicate. Information processing, sometimes they can get on overload. Think about it like a sponge. Once that sponge is saturated, it just can't hold any more water and it shuts down like a computer. Their struggle changes to the status quo, so that's why transition, so going to school, changing classes, will be areas that children often struggle who are autistic. And multitasking is not something that they want to do. And again, I would never say that autistic people are not capable of it. It's just not their thing, and they have to learn to do it in a way that works for them. But their strengths, man, their attention to detail, the stories I could tell. Attention to detail saves time, saves money, saves mistakes, and it is a visceral feeling for them. They are very process driven. So many of your autistic kids, you give them the rules and they will follow those rules. You don't have to tell them that the stove is hot twice. But then they might struggle to touch the stove when they're older, when they're old enough to start cooking because the stove is hot. I'm not supposed to touch it. They're very logical thinkers. So if you need to take the emotion out of a decision you're making, so something like a house move, talk to an autistic person because they will help remove that emotion and help you go through that logical process. Their ability to retain information, man, all of you who are parents of autistic children, if you've not been through the Pokemon stage yet, get ready for it, because you are going to learn details about Pokemon that you never thought, because they have fixated interest and they go incredibly deep with them. They're also incredibly efficient people, to the point that wasting time is about the biggest sin that you can have with an autistic child. So how do we support them? We want to give them as much predictability as possible. This is across the board. So our autistic children love predictability. Our ADHD children on the other side of it need that border to bounce off of. So I'm going to push as hard as I can on that border, but I need it to be safe and I need that structure to be there. Same thing with our dyslexic children. If I know that homework time is from 4 to 5, I can bring myself together to do that and access that working memory. Know that there's a difference between the anticipatory anxiety that children have and a honeymoon period. This is especially true at the beginning of the school year. So when they start a new task, things seem really okay. And that's the honeymoon period. But what's really happening and brewing under the surface is this anticipatory anxiety of what might be happening. So we have to kind of check in with our kids and be aware. Uncertainty is visceral. So they may not even have it in their brain yet that they're uncertain, but they will feel physical pain. I cannot emphasize this enough, that uncertainty It is so uncomfortable that it makes them sick to their stomach. It can cause back and neck problems. It is very, 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 very uncomfortable. So we want to make sure that our neurodivergent children are certain about what the ways to go forward and the rules, as well as the expectations that we have for them. And the biggest way that we can support them is with time and understanding. There are things, it can be frustrating when you have a 12-year-old who can't tie their shoes yet. As a parent, other parents who don't know what's going on are judging you. Even grandparents and family members might be like, I can't believe he's 12 years old and he can't tie his shoes. But you know that with dyspraxia, learning to tie your shoes is not something that comes easily to you. So if they need to learn to tie their shoes when they're 15, that's okay. We're not on anybody's timeline but their own. So when working with the SEND team, as a former SENCO, I'm going to tell you kind of a behind the scenes truth that is really hard to hear. And the first one is to drop your emotions. And I know that's hard. And I've been there on the other side of the table as well, because there is nothing that gives you the feels more than your children. Of course not. And you know that with some teachers across their education, you are having to be a stronger advocate, we'll say, than with others. But when you walk into that meeting and you start to cry, the team shuts down and thinks that you're over emotional and stops listening to you. And it's a hard truth to learn. And it's something that I have learned the hard way, even though I experienced it on the other side, because dealing with your emotions is not their job, even though it is a ripple effect of what they do. But it makes everything that you say sound as something that gets judged. Instead, go in with a business meeting mentality. So I'm not saying you can't be angry, and I'm not saying you can't be worried or that you can't be any of these things, but you treat it like a business meeting. You go in and you use words like, I'm concerned because my child is not receiving the support that is legally, that they're legally entitled to by their EHCP, as opposed to, you're not doing your job and my kid's coming home. As soon as you start going into that, they shut down and they don't listen. You can be firm and you can be assertive without being aggressive, just like you can convey your concern without becoming overly emotional. Now, as soon as those meetings are over, you go have a cup of tea with a friend and you get it all out. But in that meeting, I cannot stress enough, the best way to get what you want for your child is to maintain that professional demeanor. Make sure you contract either verbally or written. If you can get it written, it's even better. Protocols and expectations. So what are my child's needs? How are they going to be accommodated? How often are they legally required to those accommodations? So if your child has a full-time assistant and they're using that assistant for other children, that is not okay. That's not what that assistant is there for. Check on the accommodations and make sure that this is happening. I'd say especially for your dyslexic or lens children who are getting colored paper. There are some teachers who forget, and it's okay, they're people too, but sometimes teachers need to be reminded, no, my child's test is on colored paper. And your child will struggle to advocate for themselves in that area. So make sure that you're checking in. Kids want to do well, and they're getting in trouble a lot, honestly, our neurodivergent kiddos. So we need to be an advocate for them so that they don't have to advocate for themselves, especially when they're little, and really especially during those middle school years, those like year 6, 7, and 8, when they don't want to look different than anybody else. And understand your role. And I say this because a lot of times you go into these SEND meetings, and it's all about, we've got 30 kids in this classroom and blah, 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 blah. And I'll say, I can appreciate that and I empathize with you. My role here is to advocate for one. So I'm going to ask you to put those 29 children aside, because we're just here to talk about the one and what her rights are legally as a child with a special education plan or an EHCP. Your role is to be there as their advocate. So don't be afraid to be that mom as long as that mom is professional, to be that dad as long as that dad is not aggressive or is not overloading teachers with unrealistic expectations. Being that parent that says, actually, no, I'm going to make sure my child gets what they're entitled to and that will help them be successful, that's your role. Advocating for your child, what do you do, right? How do I do this? That's the real trick, because man, this is a lifelong game, certainly throughout their childhood. So with their school, you set up yourself with a reputation within that school as somebody who's not going to let things drop, but somebody who treats other professionals with respect, as somebody who's not afraid to go to the principal or the head teacher or the board of governors if things are being done wrong, as somebody who's not afraid to let a teacher know when they crossed a line, but as somebody who does it in a way that is not attacking and is just holding people up to a standard. With other families, one of the most heartbreaking things to me as a mom of neurodivergent children is the few amount of birthday party invitations that they get. I know that sounds ridiculous to people with neurotypical children or children who do not have behaviors that get looked at as othered, but it's devastating when when you see people going to a birthday party and your kids just maybe gets 2 a year. So being willing to go out there to the other moms and say, hey, you know, I'm not trying to tell you what to do or whatever, but would you mind including my kid? You might get looks and you might get judged by those other parents, but then your kid gets included. So you have to be willing to take that judgment and take that kind of, I can't believe she did that. I don't care. You cannot believe what I do as long as my child's getting the best that they want for them and for their emotional benefit. With relatives is a really tough one. So when again, 4 kids who are neurodivergent, when my oldest was starting down the path, a very well-intentioned family member said to me, but there's nothing wrong with him. He just needs more love. Y'all, it was like a red flag to a bull. I'm like, this child is loved. And I couldn't even come out with something rational, and I'm a talker, but like, it was so offensive to me. And eventually I was able to sit down with this person and say, you know what, I just want to let you know there is nothing wrong with him. And he's autistic. So I need you to wrap your head around the fact that there is nothing wrong with being autistic. And if you can't handle that, then at least keep your mouth shut for me, please. Thank you. And oftentimes with relatives, they're going to roll their eyes and they're going to say, oh, well, how come he can't sit at dinner for as long as you want him to? Or how shouldn't he be able to tie his shoes? Or shouldn't they be able to should? And I always tell them, stop shoulding all over the place and just let them be them and let them learn on their timeline. I promise I'm challenging them as their parent, but at a level that's appropriate for them. And the most important way to advocate for your child is to advocate with them. Teach them to advocate for themselves. Let them know what it means to be neurodivergent. Let them find pride in that. Let them find where they excel and let them learn how to say, I have a right to support and I have a right to be successful. So I always have a word from Drake. He's my oldest. Because I asked him one time, how would you describe being autistic to other people? And he's like, well, it's like if you take me, a white American British boy, and you stuck me in the middle of like 1860s rural Japan. In the beginning, I'm going to be freaking out. I'm not going to like the food. I'm not going to know how to speak. I'm not going to know what they're doing or how they behave. And I'm going to stand out like a sore thumb. Eventually, I'll learn how to behave here. And I will learn the customs and I might even learn to eat the food. Who knows? But I'm always going to look different and I'm always going to have an accent. And I just need people to be okay with that. Y'all, I couldn't have said it better myself. I love my kid. So I stole it and I put it in a presentation. So just remember, your kid's going to have an accent. We just want to let them know that that's okay.